An HOA thought they could run me off my own ranch. They put a fence up to block my access and even cut off the water to my cattle, laughing while they did it. They thought I was just some dumb hick they could roll over, a relic of the past standing in the way of their precious manicured lawns. But what they didn't know was that with every arrogant letter they sent, every fine they piled on, every foot fence they put up, they were walking deeper into a legal trap I was setting for them. A trap that wouldn't just give me my land back, but would cost them everything. My name is Ethan, and this land has been my life for as long as I can remember. It's more than just a plot of dirt. It's the living, breathing story of my family. My grandfather, a man with hands like worn leather and a will of iron, bought this spread when this whole valley was nothing but open sky. He carved this ranch out of the wilderness with pure grit. He passed it to my father, who taught me how to read the seasons and the wind and the health of a calf in its walk. And then he passed it to me. This isn't just a business. It's a legacy. Every fence post hammered into ground. Every calf born in the pale light of dawn is a continuation of their story. The ranch house, built from timber cleared off our own land, holds the echoes of 3 generations. When you have roots that deep, you don't just own the land. You belong to it. The heart of the ranch, the lifeblood of the whole operation, is a stretch of land we've always called Willow Creek pasture. It's a lush, green basin carved by a creek that, unlike most in this part of Texas, runs year-round. That creek isn't just a pretty feature. It's the only reliable, natural water source for my entire herd. For 100 years, our cattle have watered there, finding shade under the willows that give the pasture its name. It's an essential, irreplaceable part of this ranch. The deed my grandfather filed, the one my father honored, and the one I hold now, clearly marks Willow Creek pasture as part of our property. It was never even a question. For decades, our only neighbors were coyotes and hawks. But times change. About 10 years ago, a developer bought the property next door. The rolling hills to the east were flattened, and soon a sea of beige houses with perfectly green lawns rose up. They called it Serenity Meadows. We watched it grow with a sort of detached curiosity. The construction noise was a pain, but we were separated by a line of old oak trees, and we mostly kept to ourselves. The first folks who moved into Serenity Meadows were fine. They were families looking for a slice of the quiet life, and seemed to respect the line between their world and mine. They'd wave when I drove my truck past their entrance. Their kids would sometimes watch the cattle from a distance. We were different, but there was an unspoken understanding. They had their world, and I had mine. Life was peaceful. I thought it would always be that way. I was dead wrong. The trouble began quietly, the way a storm builds on the horizon. It started with an election. The original HOA board was made up of laid-back folks who cared more about pool hours than empire building. But as the development grew, a new type of homeowner moved in. City people who brought the city mindset with them. They wanted control, uniformity, and their champion was a woman named Brenda Reynolds. Brenda was a transplant from some big city high-rise who decided her life's new mission was to whip Serenity Meadows into shape. She had a steely smile, a clipboard that was practically glued to her hand, and an unshakable belief that she was always right. She got elected HOA president by promising to protect property values, which was code for making everyone and everything conform. From her back patio, Brenda didn't see a historic ranch. She saw an eyesore. She looked at Willow Creek pasture and saw weeds, mud, and a mess. In her mind, that land was a blemish on her serenity. Soon at HOA meetings, she started referring to my family's land by a new name. She called it HOA Common Area C. The first official shot came in a crisp white envelope. The letter was polite, almost condescending. It was from the HOA signed by Brenda, cordially requesting that I cease and desist all agricultural activities on community common land, specifically the area designated as Common Area C. It said my cattle were a liability and violated HOA bylaws. I actually laughed when I first read it. This had to be a mistake. A ridiculous, bureaucratic screw-up. I picked up the phone and called the number. Brenda herself answered, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. I explained who I was and that they'd clearly made an error. That pasture, I said, try and keep my voice even, is not your common area. It's been part of my family's ranch for 100 years. There was a pause. Well, Mr. Ethan, she said, the sweetness curdling into a sharp, patronizing tone, I'm looking at the developer's official plats right now, and they clearly show that parcel as community property, intended for future development. Perhaps your records are a bit outdated. I was floored. I told her I had the deed, a legal document filed with the county. I offered to bring it over. That won't be necessary, she said dismissively. The HOA's legal counsel has reviewed the plats, and our position is firm. You have 30 days to remove your livestock. Have a wonderful day. And she hung up. That phone call was the first tremor. I drove to the county records office the next day, just to see it with my own eyes. There was, clear as day, the property line that put Willow Creek pasture squarely on my side. But when I asked to see the plats for the Serenity Meadows development, I saw the problem. The developer's map was ambiguous. It showed their property line next to mine, but the area that was my pasture was shaded and just labeled undeveloped. To Brenda, undeveloped meant ours to develop. My deed was just an old piece of paper. Their modern plat was a new reality. They didn't care about history or deeds or the truth. They had a vision, and my land was their canvas. Brenda Reynolds was not a woman who took no for an answer. My refusal wasn't a legal dispute to her. It was an act of defiance to be crushed. The HOA, under her command, doubled down with shocking speed. First, she held a special meeting, pitching it as an exciting reveal of the Phase 2 Community Enhancement Project. Of course, I wasn't invited. I only found out from a neighbor who was getting nervous about Brenda's fanaticism. He told me she put on a full presentation, with drawings of a park, a dog run, and a gazebo, all right on top of Willow Creek pasture. She painted me as a stubborn, greedy old rancher hoarding community land. The vote to move forward was unanimous. A week later, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines. I walked to the edge of my property and just stood there. A fencing crew was already sinking metal posts along the line Brenda had decided was the boundary. They were fencing me out of my own land. I ran out there, waving my deed, telling the foreman he was on private property. He just shrugged, looking a little sorry for me. Sorry, pal, he said. Got a work order from the HOA. They're paying the bill. Your problem is with them. By noon, the fence was up. A 6-foot-tall chain-link barrier now separated my ranch from Willow Creek pasture. They had cut me off, but they had done something far worse, something cruel. They had cut my cattle off from their water. The panic set in almost right away. A herd of several hundred cattle drinks a staggering amount of water. By that afternoon, they were starting to cluster by the new fence, lowing with confusion and thirst, smelling the water they couldn't get to. It was heartbreaking. My animals were suffering because of this. I called the sheriff. A deputy came out, looked at the fence, listened to my story, and just shook his head. I hear you, Ethan, he said, but this is a civil matter. It's a property dispute. I can't tear down a fence. You're going to need a court order. The classic response that leaves you feeling completely helpless. That afternoon, I frantically made calls and finally found a company that could truck in water. The cost was astronomical. It was a massive expense I knew I couldn't keep up for long. Watching my savings drain away, watching my herd drink from a dusty trough instead of their creek, felt like a personal failure. I hired the only property lawyer I could afford, a man named David. He was honest from the start. Fighting an HOA is a nightmare, Ethan, he told me. They use the homeowner's own money to fund a war of attrition. They can outspend you until you give up or go broke. We can file for an injunction, but it's a long, expensive fight. Our first legal letter was met with a response from a huge law firm in Dallas. Their letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, questioning my old deed and stating the HOA would not only defend its right to the land, but would also sue me for their legal fees. To add insult to injury, another envelope arrived from the HOA a few days later. It was a bill for half the cost of the fence they had illegally built on my property. The siege had begun. The next few months were the hardest of my life. Every day was a battle. The water trucks were a constant, hemorrhaging drain on my finances. I had to sell off part of my herd just to cover the costs. A decision that felt like cutting off a piece of my soul. The residents of Serenity Meadows, with a few quiet exceptions, treated me like a villain. Brenda Reynolds would often stand on her patio, watching my water delivery with a smug, satisfied smirk. Legally, we were sinking in quicksand. David filed for an injunction to have the fence removed, but the HOA's lawyers were masters of delay. They buried us in paperwork, every move designed to bleed me dry. They even filed a potential lien against my entire ranch, citing the unpaid bill for the fence and thousands in fines. It was a scare tactic, meant to force me to surrender. I was breaking. I was exhausted, angry, and for the first time, hopeless. My family's legacy was slipping away because a committee wanted a new place to walk their poodles. The pressure was immense. People started whispering that I should just sell the pasture, that I should be a good neighbor. One night, sitting with David and surrounded by maps, I finally boiled over. I can't win this, David. I said, they have an army and I'm just one man. David leaned back, his face grim. They think they've already won, he said quietly. Brenda is parading around like she's a hero. They're getting arrogant. He paused, then leaned forward. Arrogant people make mistakes. They get careless. Right now, we're fighting on their terms. What if we change the battlefield? That's when the seed of the trap was planted. We decided on a new strategy. Feign defeat. I went quiet. I told David to slow his responses. I sold a few more cattle, making a public show of the hardship. The rumors started flying that I was on the verge of bankruptcy. To Brenda and the HOA, it looked like they had finally broken the stubborn old rancher. While they were celebrating, David and I started a different kind of war in the dusty archives of the county courthouse. We weren't just looking at my deed anymore. We were digging into the history of Serenity Meadows itself. We pulled every document on the original developer, Meadows Development Corporation, and that's when we found it. The needle in the haystack. Meadows Development Corporation had gone bankrupt in the mid-90s. In the chaos, the main assets, the house lots, were transferred to a new company, but a clerk processing the final transfer had missed one little thing. They forgot to include the title for that one odd-shaped, undeveloped parcel of land, Willow Creek pasture. It was a clerical error, a forgotten footnote in a decades-old corporate death. The title to my pasture had never been legally transferred to the Serenity Meadows HOA. It didn't belong to them. Legally, it was an unowned, abandoned asset of a corporation that didn't exist anymore. David looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This is it," he whispered. "This is a trap." He explained that Texas law has obscure procedures for dealing with assets of defunct corporations. The plan was audacious. We wouldn't fight the HOA over who the land used to belong to. We would make it belong to me. While they were planning their gazebo, we were quietly filing a petition with the state. It cost me the last of my savings, a final, desperate gamble. Finally, the day came. For a small fee paid to the state of Texas, I legally purchased the entirety of the defunct Meadows Development Corporation, and with that, I became the sole owner of its only remaining asset, a brand new, ironclad title to Willow Creek pasture. I now own the land twice over. The HOA thought they were about to break ground on their new park. In reality, they were about to become trespassers on land I secretly and indisputably now owned. The trap was set. The HOA's arrogance was our greatest ally. Flush with what they thought was a victory, Brenda and the board announced a groundbreaking ceremony for their park. They sent out newsletters and even invited a local news crew. They were so sure of themselves they didn't even wait for our legal battle to be formally over. The day before the ceremony, they brought in the bulldozers. That was the last piece of the puzzle. My lawyer had me install security cameras overlooking the pasture weeks earlier. I now had crystal clear video of bulldozers rolling onto my property and scraping away the grass. It was no longer a dispute over a fence. It was willful destruction of private property. With the evidence in hand, David filed an emergency motion and a lawsuit for trespassing and destruction of property. This time, we weren't arguing about old deeds. We were presenting a simple case of ownership. The scene in that courtroom is one I'll never forget. Brenda sat at the table with her expensive lawyers. wearing a tailored suit and a smug look. She glanced at me in my worn jeans and work shirt with utter contempt. She thought this was her victory lap. Her lawyer launched into a long speech about community rights and property values, painting me as an unreasonable man holding the whole neighborhood hostage. When he finally finished, the judge turned to us. "Mr. David," he said, sounding tired, "this seems like a standard boundary dispute." David stood up, holding a single, slim file. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "this is not a boundary dispute. This is a simple case of trespassing. The Serenity Meadows HOA has illegally occupied, fenced, and now begun to demolish a piece of private property belonging to my client." The HOA's lawyer actually laughed. "Objection! That is the very point of contention." David just smiled faintly. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A." He handed a document to the clerk. "This is a certified title deed filed with this county 3 weeks ago, confirming the sale of Willow Creek pasture to my client. And here," he continued, adding another document, "is Exhibit B, the bill of sale from the state of Texas, transferring ownership of the Meadows Development Corporation and all its assets to my client. The HOA has never, at any point, held title to this land." A stunned silence fell over the room. The judge picked up the documents. The HOA's lawyers rushed to the bench, their faces a mass of confusion and panic. I just watched Brenda. The smug look evaporated, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. Her jaw went slack. The color drained from her face as she realized what had happened. She had been so focused on bullying me that she and her high-priced lawyers failed to do the one thing that mattered: confirm they actually owned the land they were trying to take. David wasn't done. "And for the past 24 hours, he said, his voice ringing with authority, "the defendant has had heavy machinery on my client's property. We have video of the damage. We are asking for an injunction, an order to remove the fence at their expense, and full restitution for all damages, including the water deliveries, legal fees, and punitive damages for this malicious campaign." The judge looked up from the deeds, his eyes now fixed on Brenda and her lawyers. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold fury. "Counsel," he said to the HOA's lawyer, his voice dangerously low, "is this true? Did you begin construction without a clear title?" The lawyer stammered, speechless. The trap hadn't just been sprung. Its jaws had snapped shut. The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. A total victory. He ordered the HOA to get every piece of equipment off my land by the end of the day. They were found guilty of trespassing and property damage. The final order was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. The HOA had to remove the entire fence at their own cost within 48 hours. The fallout in Serenity Meadows was catastrophic for the board. The news story wasn't about a triumphant groundbreaking. It was about a humiliating courtroom defeat and a massive financial liability. The homeowners, who had been footing the bill all along, were furious. They had been led into a costly, illegal war by Brenda's hubris. There was an emergency meeting, and this time the vote was for her immediate resignation. Disgraced and defeated, she disappeared from the neighborhood almost overnight. The day the fence came down, I didn't watch. I waited until the crew was gone. I walked out the open boundary with a pair of wire cutters, snipped off the no trespassing sign they had posted, and walked to the gate on my side of the ranch. I unlocked it and swung it wide open. There's no sound quite like a herd of thirsty cattle moving toward water. It was a low, rumbling thunder. I stood back and watched as they poured into Willow Creek pasture. They walked, then trotted, then ran the last few yards to the creek, lowering their heads to drink. That sight, my animals drinking freely from my family's creek on my family's land, was a more profound victory than any courtroom judgment. This was a long and bitter fight, but it shows what can happen when you stand up against an overreaching HOA. Have you ever had a run-in with an HOA that overstepped its bounds? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd like to hear it. And if you enjoyed the story of justice being served, please give us a like and subscribe for more. In the end, this wasn't just about a fence or a piece of land. It was about respect. I didn't win by being louder. I won by being smarter and by using their own arrogance against them. Brenda Reynolds and her board underestimated me. They saw an old rancher, not a man defending a century-old legacy. They learn the hard way that you should never corner an animal on its own territory, because it will always find a way to fight back. My story is just a reminder that you're home, and your rights are always worth fighting for. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should be most worried about.